Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So in another video on how to deal with temper tantrums, one of the suggestions was that if your kid is having a tantrum, it's important for you as a parent to stay calm. Now this of course is sometimes easier said than done. So the current video was initially intended to illustrate some psychological approaches for managing frustration or anger in the context of kids having tantrums. However, the ideas discussed are relevant to other contexts in which you might find yourself responding with frustration or anger when parenting. The suggestions considered are mainly based on the CBT principle that how we think about the things that happen to us contributes to how we feel and behave. So, changing the way we think can change the way we feel and behave. I won't go into a lot of detail about CBT in this video, but for a more in-depth introduction, you can check out my video in the link below. So, on to the first suggestion, which is try not to think in terms of should or must. I'll start with a hypothetical. Suppose you have two parents, Jim and Bob, who each have a 3-year-old kid. Jim's kid has a tantrum and Jim thinks this should not be happening, she should have better control of herself. Bob's kid has a tantrum and Bob thinks, here we go again, I'd really rather this not be happening right now, but what are you going to do? Who's more likely to feel angry? Hopefully you'll agree it's Jim. And in short, the reason for this is that Jim is thinking in terms of shoulds or musts. The potential problem in thinking in this way is that we don't give ourselves any psychological wiggle room. That is, we're saying this is the way things should be and that's that. And this is fine when the world is the way we think it should be, but you'd be a very lucky person to find the world is always the way you reckon it should be. So a couple of tips for dealing with shoulds and musts are, first, consider whether the should or must is appropriate. For example, should a 3-year-old really be on top of their emotions and behavior? Probably not. Second, reframe the should or must in terms of preferences. For example, my kid should not be having tantrums versus I prefer it if my kid didn't have tantrums. But I guess that's just what kids do. Next suggestion is try not to control your kid's emotions or behavior. Now this suggestion is actually similar to the previous one, but comes at things from a slightly different angle. So I'll start with an assumption. When a kid has a tantrum, most parents would prefer if this would stop sooner rather than later. However, as mentioned in another article, the problem with a kid having a tantrum is that once the tantrum gets going, there's often not a lot you can do to stop it. Or to put it differently, you have no, or at least little, control over the tantrum. So it's possible that if you find yourself getting frustrated or angry when your kid has a tantrum, or whatever else, you may be getting caught up in trying to, unsuccessfully, control this emotion or behavior. Now the question to ask is, can you control another person's emotional behavior? Now it's probably fair to say that you can influence another person's emotional behavior. For example, that's why we've got advertising. However, in most circumstances, you can't entirely control another person's emotional behavior. And so when you're faced with things that you can't control, like your kid's emotions and behavior when they're having a tantrum, then it's over to the so-called serenity prayer, which encourages us to accept the things we cannot change. That is, by accepting our kids' emotions or behavior, at least at that moment in time, we're going to be less likely to get angry. So now I want to address unhelpful tantrum explanations. So sometimes you might find yourself wondering why your kid is having a tantrum. Now, if you do this and you're getting frustrated or angry, then chances are your explanation of why your kid is having a tantrum is not a benign one. Now, there's probably a bunch of different examples, but to illustrate one, I can remember another parent saying something along the lines of, I swear my kid does that, have a tantrum, on purpose sometimes. Now, if you came out with that explanation, then it wouldn't be surprising if you got frustrated or angry. So, to cut a long story short, the reason a kid is having a tantrum is often benign, in the sense that it reflects them not having developed the skills to manage their emotions. And for more on how to teach kids emotion regulation skills, you can check out my video in the link below. Or maybe them not knowing how to adequately deal with the situation they're in. Or generally it's just them going through a perfectly normal part of their development. And for more on the developmental trajectory of tantrums, you can check out my video in the link below. So next suggestion is identify and address the primary emotion. So frustration and anger are often thought of as secondary emotions. And what's meant by this is that these emotions come along following a primary emotion, often anxiety or sadness. So the idea is that you need to address the primary emotion rather than the anger. So to illustrate, Jim's kid has a tantrum in the middle of a shopping center. Jim gets angry. What could be the primary emotion in this example? Well, suppose Jim was thinking, everyone is looking at me, they probably all think I'm a bad parent because my kid can't control themselves. Now, if you had this thought, how might you feel? Probably anxious because the thought concerns negative evaluation by others. Now suppose Jim was instead thinking, I'm such a terrible parent, my kid can't control themselves. Now if you had this same thought, how might you feel? Probably sad because the thought concerns negative self-evaluation. So in these examples, the primary emotion is either anxiety or sadness, but what gets expressed is anger. And there are different reasons why people think this happens, but that doesn't matter right now. Thus, as mentioned, another thing that can be done when experiencing frustration or anger is to try and identify what emotion may lie underneath that frustration or anger and focus on dealing with that emotion rather than the frustration or anger itself. And one way to deal with the primary emotion is to challenge the validity of the thoughts that might be driving that emotion in the first place. And this is probably a good point to remind you to check out my introduction to CBT, and you can check out that video in the link below. So to illustrate, consider the example where Jim is thinking everyone is looking at me. They probably all think that I'm a bad parent because my kid can't control themselves. And consequently, he's feeling anxious and angry. There are a bunch of different ways of challenging this anxiety eliciting thought, and I'll go through a few of them quickly. First, is everyone really looking at you? Probably not. However, we often think the spotlight is on us when in fact few, if anyone, is actually looking. Second, are other people really thinking you're a bad parent? Maybe, but maybe not. For example, they might instead be thinking that poor parent, kids can be difficult. Or that parent is doing a pretty good job of managing that tantrum. Or perhaps, phew, thank crap I don't have to deal with that. Third, the reason Jim's thought is leading to anxiety is probably because Jim is also thinking it would be bad if other people think I'm a bad parent. And when you're talking about social anxiety related thoughts, you kind of always end up here. Does it really matter what other people think? Now, without getting into a whole thing about this, generally speaking, there are times when it's probably helpful to care a little bit about what others think of us. However, while it may be worth caring a little, it's probably not worth caring a lot. Now, each of these examples challenge the validity of Jim's thought that everyone is looking at me. They probably all think that I'm a bad parent because my kid can't control themselves, in ways that render the thought very likely untrue. And if the thought is untrue, then this would reduce or eliminate Jim's anxiety response and in turn his anger. So that is a very quick illustration of CBT. And again, for more information, check out my video in the link below. Now, the final strategy that you'll commonly see suggested is that when you notice yourself feeling frustrated or angry, take a few deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth before you respond. There are plenty of YouTube clips on breathing exercises for anger management out there, so I won't worry about going through any of them here. So for the moment though, that's a crash course in management of frustration or anger. If there's anything I've gotten wrong or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.